Helen Zick's life had never been easy, but it was one she had come to accept. Raised by her aunt and uncle after the tragic deaths of her parents, she had learned early that survival meant selflessness. She was an orphan, but that fact barely mattered in the dusty village of Nalap, where most of the villagers had their own struggles to contend with. Her aunt, Margaret, and her uncle, Ben, were decent people but far from kind-hearted. They saw her more as a responsibility, a means to lessen the burden on their already overworked lives. They treated her like family only because they had to, but the warmth of that title had long since faded. She was a worker, a cook, a cleaner, a seller. All her life, she had been expected to take care of their home, help her aunt in the market selling food, and bear the weight of their collective chores without complaint. Her cousin, Daniel, had been an entirely different matter. Lazy and entitled, he spent his days lounging around the house, playing cards with his friends, and looking for easy ways to get by. Helen, on the other hand, never complained. Even as a child, she had learned to keep her head down and do as she was told. She had no choice, she was alone in this world, and though they weren't her parents, her aunt and uncle had provided a roof over her head, barely. As she helped her aunt set up the food stall in the early hours of the morning, Helen couldn't help but think of her parents. They had died in a car crash when she was only 5, and she had never known the comfort of their love and protection. She had only a few blurry memories of her mother, her soft voice, her warm arms, and the smell of lavender, and a flash of her father, holding her hand as they crossed the street. But they were all gone now. And as she pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders against the early morning chill, she knew she was on her own. Helen's aunt bustled around her, scolding her for not being quick enough as they set up their food stall in the bustling village square. It wasn't the first time she had been scolded for something minor, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. As the villagers began to gather, Helen set out the steaming pots of beans, rice, and porridge that her aunt had prepared the night before. The scent of the food mingled with the fresh morning air, drawing people in. "Move faster, Helen. You're making us look bad," her aunt snapped, her voice high-pitched and demanding. Helen nodded silently, pushing down the wave of frustration that always seemed to rise within her. She didn't mind the work, it had become second nature, but the constant criticism wore her down. She often found herself lost in thoughts about what her life could have been like had things turned out differently. What would it have been like to have a mother who hugged her when she was sad? What if her father had been there to tell her stories at night? Would they have loved her as much as they loved each other? Would her life have been different? But there was no use in dwelling on the past. She had no choice but to live the life she had been given. A few hours passed, and by midday, the food stall was nearly empty, save for a few leftover servings. As Helen wiped down the counter, she caught a glimpse of a man standing across the street. He was tall, with broad shoulders, wearing a simple shirt and jeans. His face was unfamiliar, and yet there was something about him that caught her attention. She couldn't put her finger on it, maybe it was the way he stood so still, as though he were observing everything with a quiet intensity, but something about him intrigued her. She saw him glance in her direction, and for a moment, their eyes met. Helen quickly turned away, embarrassed by the encounter, and focused on packing up the last of the dishes. The man didn't linger, though. He disappeared into the crowd of villagers, and she didn't think much more of it. "Time to go, Helen," her aunt called, pulling her out of her thoughts. "We've sold most of the food. We'll head back before the afternoon heat makes it impossible to carry all this stuff." As they began to pack up the stall, Helen glanced at the empty street again. The man was gone, but something in her chest stirred, as though she were meant to meet him somehow, as though their paths would cross again soon. She shook her head, laughing at herself. "You're being foolish," she muttered under her breath. "Why would someone like that take an interest in you?" But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this life than what she had known. She wasn't sure what it was, perhaps it was just a wishful thought, but the man's eyes had held something she hadn't seen in a long time, a spark of curiosity, a glance that said he saw her, truly saw her. Helen's days blended into one another, each one indistinguishable from the last. After another long day of setting up the stall and helping her aunt pack away the leftover food, she walked slowly back to the small, worn-out house she shared with her aunt and uncle. The evening was peaceful, but an undercurrent of tension always seemed to linger in the air at home, especially when it came to her cousin Daniel. Daniel had been lounging around the house all day, like he often did, and was now sprawled across the living room couch, idly flicking through a magazine. Helen barely registered his presence. It was hard to notice him when he did nothing but complain and avoid any work. Her mind was elsewhere. As she entered the house, her aunt was at the stove, stirring a pot of soup with a deep frown. Her uncle was sitting at the table, reading the local newspaper, but he looked up when Helen walked in. "You're late," her uncle, Ben, grumbled. "Your aunt's been waiting for you to help with dinner." Helen gave a quick nod, knowing better than to argue. She had learned long ago that any complaint would be met with annoyance or even scorn. It wasn't just the chores or the long hours, it was the constant, nagging feeling of being treated like an outsider in a house that was supposed to be her home. But she didn't say anything. She had long since given up on speaking her mind. As she went to grab a cloth to set the table, her aunt cleared her throat, a strange, calculating look in her eyes. "Helen, come sit for a moment," Margaret said, her voice sharp but controlled. Helen hesitated for a moment, glancing at her uncle, who gave her a silent nod. Her aunt's tone was always a warning, one that suggested something was coming, something she wouldn't like. Sighing, Helen sat down at the table, wiping her hands on her apron. "You've been working hard lately," her aunt began, her eyes narrowing as she spoke. "Too hard, in fact. It's time you think about your future." Helen's heart skipped a beat. She didn't need to hear the words to understand what was coming. She had heard it before, but never so directly. "Helen," her uncle joined in, not looking up from his newspaper, "Daniel's getting to an age where he needs a wife. You're both about the same age, so we've been thinking." "No, Ben," Margaret interrupted, her voice suddenly cold. "We need to be realistic. You're not getting any younger, Helen. It's time to find someone who can take care of you." Helen stiffened, the room closing in around her. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. She already had a sinking feeling of where this was going. Her aunt didn't hesitate. "We've arranged for you to marry Mikkel Samson. You're not getting any younger, and he's an eligible bachelor who lives just outside the village. He's a farmer, but he's good, solid, and dependable. A man like that will take care of you, and you won't have to worry about a thing." Helen's heart seemed to stop. Mikkel Samson. The name echoed in her mind, but it didn't make sense. She had only seen him a handful of times, and each encounter had been brief, fleeting. He was a quiet man, always observing from the corners of the market or the outskirts of the village, never really drawing attention to himself. "Wait," Helen said, her voice rising in disbelief. "I barely know him. How can you decide this for me?" Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Because, my dear, you've been here long enough. You've worked hard, and now it's time for you to marry and take care of your own life. And it's a good match, Helen. Don't question it." Her uncle finally looked up from the paper, his expression unreadable. "You'll be taken care of, Helen. Mikkel will provide for you. You'll have a stable life. Isn't that what you want?" But Helen was already shaking her head, the reality of the situation sinking in. "I don't know him. I want to choose my own path. Why can't I decide who I marry?" Her aunt's face hardened, her voice turning sharp. "You don't have that luxury, Helen. You don't get to choose. This is the life you'll have." The word stung more than Helen was willing to admit. Her aunt had never really treated her like a daughter, but this felt like the ultimate betrayal. Helen had worked tirelessly for years, never asking for anything, never expecting more than to be treated with the smallest bit of kindness. But this was different. This was about control, about using her to solve their own problems. Why him? Helen whispered, looking at her aunt through teary eyes. Why Mikkel? Her uncle grunted from his seat. Because he's a good man. A hard-working man. You'll be lucky to have him. Now go to bed. We'll speak to him tomorrow. The words were final. There would be no argument. There would be no second chance to plead her case. Helen's stomach twisted in knots, and as she stood up to leave the room, her heart was heavy with the weight of the decision that had already been made for her. The days after the conversation felt like a blur. Helen barely had time to process what had happened before her aunt and uncle were already making plans. They were going to meet Mikkel, finalize everything, and have the wedding soon. It was all happening so fast, and it felt like her life was spiraling out of her control. Helen spent the next few days helping her aunt prepare for the meeting. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but she didn't know what else to do. Her heart ached with the thought of being forced into a marriage with someone she barely knew. But it wasn't as if she had any other choice. One afternoon, as she was walking back from the market, she caught sight of Mikkel again. He was standing by the side of the road, leaning against a tree, looking out across the fields. His expression was unreadable, but there was a calmness about him that contrasted sharply with the turmoil inside her. Helen's heart skipped a beat. The world around her seemed to fade as she looked at him, and she couldn't help but feel an odd pull toward him, an instinctive attraction that she couldn't explain. She walked past him, pretending not to notice, but she felt his eyes on her. For a moment, everything seemed to stand still. The days that followed felt like they were moving in slow motion. Helen's life, once so predictable, had taken a strange and unsettling turn. Her aunt and uncle's plan was set in motion. She was to marry Mikkel Samson, the farmer she barely knew. It wasn't a decision she could change. The more she thought about it, the more hopeless it seemed. She had tried to push back, even just a little, but her aunt's sharp words had silenced her protests. And her uncle, who had once been so quiet and kind, now seemed like a man she didn't recognize. He had become just another enforcer of the life they were pushing onto her. As the days slipped by, Helen found herself avoiding her aunt and uncle's conversation. She buried herself in the chores they assigned her, keeping busy so she wouldn't have to think about what was coming. The days that followed felt like they were moving in slow motion. Helen's life, once so predictable, had taken a strange and unsettling turn. Her aunt and uncle's plan was set in motion. She was to marry Mikkel Samson, the farmer she barely knew. It wasn't a decision she could change. The more she thought about it, the more hopeless it seemed. She had tried to push back, even just a little, but her aunt's sharp words had silenced her protests. And her uncle, who had once been so quiet and kind, now seemed like a man she didn't recognize. He had become just another enforcer of the life they were pushing onto her. As the days slipped by, Helen found herself avoiding her aunt and uncle's conversation. She buried herself in the chores they assigned her, keeping busy so she wouldn't have to think about what was coming. Her life was being planned out for her, and there was nothing she could do about it. That evening, as she prepared the evening meal, her uncle made an unexpected announcement. "Helen, Mikkel is coming over tomorrow," he said, his voice flat. "We'll finalize the plans then." Helen's heart tightened at the mention of Mikkel. She hadn't seen him for days, not since their brief encounter by the tree. She had tried to push the memory of him out of her mind, but it lingered in her thoughts, inexplicably strong. "You should wear something nice tomorrow," her aunt added from the kitchen, not looking up from her work. "Mikkel is a respectable man, and we want him to see you at your best." Helen nodded silently, her stomach turning. The idea of meeting Mikkel, of being in his presence once more, filled her with a mixture of dread and something she couldn't quite place. There was a tension building between them that she couldn't explain, a silent connection that unsettled her more than she cared to admit. The next day, Helen found herself standing in front of the small mirror in the corner of her room. Her hands shook slightly as she adjusted her dress. It wasn't the most expensive piece of clothing she owned, but it was clean and simple, a soft green that complemented her eyes. She stared at her reflection, hardly recognizing the girl staring back at her. The girl in the mirror wasn't the Helen who had always been strong and independent, she was someone else, a girl who had been thrust into a life she hadn't chosen. As she stepped out of the room, her aunt gave her a once-over and nodded in approval. "That'll do," she said, turning away without another word. Helen's nerves tightened. She knew that today, everything would change. She was about to meet Mikkel again, and this time, it wouldn't just be a casual greeting. She would be face to face with the man who was to be her husband. The walk to the house where Mikkel was staying felt longer than usual, the weight of each step pressing down on Helen's chest. Her mind raced with thoughts of what this meeting would mean. She knew nothing about him except that he was a farmer, nothing about his past, his dreams, or even his desires. The thought of being married to someone who was essentially a stranger filled her with a cold unease. As she approached the house, she spotted Mikkel standing on the porch, looking out across the fields. His back was to her, and for a moment, she hesitated. The sight of him standing there, so quiet and serene, stirred something in her. She couldn't pinpoint what it was, whether it was fear or something else, but it unsettled her all the same. Her aunt and uncle were already inside, and as Helen stepped up to the porch, Mikkel turned to face her. The moment their eyes met, Helen's breath caught in her throat. His gaze was steady and unwavering, and for a moment, she felt a strange jolt of recognition, as if something deep inside her stirred in response to him. "Helen," Mikkel said, his voice low and warm. "It's good to see you again." She gave him a nervous smile, unsure of what to say. The words felt heavy in her mouth, caught between politeness and a flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "It's good to see you too, Mikkel," she managed to say. He nodded, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "I know this must be difficult for you," he said quietly, his tone unexpectedly gentle. "I don't want to make things harder." Helen blinked, caught off guard by his words. She had expected him to be distant, aloof, just another man she was being forced to marry. But the kindness in his voice, the concern that seemed to linger behind his words, confused her. "I don't want to make things harder either," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know you, Mikkel. And I don't know how this will work." Michael's gaze didn't waver, and for a brief moment, there was an unspoken understanding between them. He seemed to be searching her face, as if looking for something, and for a moment, Helen wondered if he could see the turmoil that swirled within her. "You're right," Mikkel said after a pause. "This isn't easy. But we have time, Helen. We don't have to rush into anything. We'll take it slow, and if you don't feel comfortable, we can stop at any time." Helen's heart skipped a beat. His words were kind, gentle, and they filled her with a glimmer of hope. She hadn't expected this from him. She had expected indifference or perhaps even coldness from a man who was so far removed from her world. But here he was, speaking to her with more consideration than anyone had shown in a long time. Her aunt and uncle had joined them on the porch by then, standing just behind Helen. Her aunt shot a glance at Mikkel, then at Helen, and it was clear that the conversation was not going the way she had planned. "Helen, don't listen to him," her aunt interjected sharply. "He's just trying to be polite. You need to understand that this is for your own good. This is your future. You'll learn to be happy with Mikkel. He's a good man. Just do your part and everything will be fine." Helen's heart sank. She knew the truth of her aunt's words. This wasn't about love or partnership, it was about obligation. She wasn't being given a choice, she was being sold into this marriage for the sake of the family. But Mikkel. Michael's voice seemed to pull her in a different direction, one that made her feel, even if just for a moment, like she wasn't simply a pawn in a game. Mikkel glanced at her aunt and uncle with a small frown, then turned his gaze back to Helen. "I want you to know that I'm not asking for anything from you. I want us to build something together, but only if you're comfortable. I want you to be happy. This should be your decision too, not just theirs. Helen stared at him, unable to find the right words. The silence between them was heavy, and the weight of her aunt and uncle's expectations bore down on her shoulders. But there was something in Michael's eyes, something that gave her a sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance that things could be different. She just had to find the courage to believe it. Her aunt's voice broke through the moment, sharp as ever. Enough of this nonsense, she snapped. Mikkel, let's sit inside. Helen, you come with us. Don't make things harder than they need to be. Mikkel stood there for a second longer, his expression unreadable. He seemed to be grappling with something inside himself before he gave a single nod and turned toward the door. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Helen's uncle was sitting at the head of the table, a serious look on his face as he stared at the papers in front of him. Mikkel took the seat across from him, and Helen was led to a chair beside her aunt. The meal passed in silence, the clinking of silverware the only sound breaking the quiet. Helen picked at her food, her mind far away. She had never felt more like a stranger in her own life. Here she was, sitting at a table with a man who was supposed to be her future husband, but she didn't know him. And she was surrounded by the very people who had forced this situation upon her. When the meal was over, her uncle cleared his throat and set the papers down on the table. Mikkel, we've come to an agreement. Helen will marry you in 2 weeks. You'll stay here until then, and we'll make the arrangements. Mikkel glanced at Helen before looking back at her uncle. His face was calm, but there was a flicker of something Helen couldn't quite place, beneath the surface. 2 weeks, Mikkel repeated softly, almost as if he was speaking to himself. Then he looked directly at Helen. I don't want this to be rushed, but if you're certain this is what you want, I'll abide by it. I'm not here to push you, Helen. Helen met his gaze, and for the first time, she felt something shift inside her, a flicker of uncertainty, yes, but also something that almost felt like trust. She wasn't sure where this was going, but she knew one thing. Mikkel wasn't the man she had expected him to be. The following days passed in a blur. The wedding preparations continued, but Helen found herself lost in her thoughts more than anything else. She couldn't deny that a part of her was intrigued by Mikkel, by the kindness he had shown her. It was a kindness she had never expected from someone like him. A part of her even found herself longing for something, anything, that might make her feel like this wasn't all a dream. As the days wore on, Mikkel continued to be a mysterious figure in her life. He would often appear at the house, sometimes sitting with her uncle, sometimes spending quiet moments alone with her aunt. But it was always the same, polite, reserved, and seemingly unaffected by the looming wedding. One evening, as Helen sat on the porch, looking out at the horizon, she found herself thinking about Mikkel again. He was like a puzzle she couldn't solve, a man who didn't fit into the mold of the man her aunt and uncle had told her about. What was he really like? Was he as kind as he seemed, or was this all part of some larger plan she didn't understand? The next day, as Helen was helping her aunt with some tasks around the house, she overheard a conversation between her uncle and Mikkel. They were talking quietly, but she could catch bits and pieces of what they were saying. You understand what's expected, don't you? Her uncle was saying, his tone low and serious. Michael's voice was calm but firm. I do. I've already made my intentions clear to Helen. I'm not here to cause trouble. Her uncle chuckled softly. We're just making sure everything is in place. She needs to understand her place in all of this. And so do you. Helen froze, her heart racing. What did he mean by that? Her place in all of this? It was clear now, her aunt and uncle weren't seeing her as a person. She was a piece of property to be handed off. The thought made her stomach churn. But what troubled her more was Michael's response. He hadn't denied the insinuation. Did he agree with them? As her aunt called her inside, Helen forced herself to push the troubling thoughts away. But the seeds of doubt had already been planted. Later that evening, as she prepared for bed, Helen found herself staring out the small window in her room, the moonlight casting a soft glow over the fields. She thought of Mikkel, of the kindness he had shown her, and the uncertainty that lingered between them. She didn't know who he was, or what his true intentions were. But one thing was clear, her life was about to change in ways she couldn't even begin to understand. As sleep finally claimed her, Helen couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen, something that would change everything. She just didn't know what yet. The days before the wedding moved faster than Helen could comprehend. She went through the motions, helping with preparations, meeting with Mikkel occasionally, and listening to her aunt and uncle's constant chatter about the future. But despite her best efforts to distract herself, there was always the gnawing feeling in the back of her mind. What was really happening here? She was to be married in a week, yet nothing felt real. Every conversation, every glance exchanged between her aunt, uncle, and Mikkel felt distant. She no longer understood where she stood. Mikkel, on the other hand, continued to be a mystery. His presence in the house was like a quiet storm, there, but not entirely noticeable. He wasn't the type to seek attention. Most evenings, after dinner, he would retire to his room early, leaving her with more questions than answers. But that evening, something was different. Mikkel didn't retreat after dinner. Instead, he lingered in the living room, looking unusually thoughtful. Helen, who had been tending to the dishes, noticed him staring out the window, his back turned to her. It was the first time she saw him this way, vulnerable, lost in thought. Curiosity tugged at her. Despite the unease she had felt about marrying him, something about the way he appeared at that moment made her want to know more. Taking a deep breath, she approached him. "Mikkel?" she asked softly, her voice hesitant. He turned, and there it was again, that look in his eyes. It was the same intensity she had seen when their gazes had met that day. He didn't answer right away, as if considering something important. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mikkel gave a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm just thinking," he replied, almost too casually. Sometimes, it's hard to shake off the weight of decisions, especially when they affect others. Helen nodded, uncertain of how to respond. Decisions about what? He hesitated again. She noticed the muscles in his jaw tighten as he glanced toward the door, as if making sure no one was eavesdropping. "I don't want to keep secrets from you, Helen," he said quietly, and the sudden seriousness in his tone caught her off guard. "I know this situation isn't ideal, but there are things about me you don't know." Helen's heart raced, the words hanging in the air like an electric charge. "What do you mean?" Mikkel stood up, his large frame casting a shadow in the dimly lit room. "I'm not who you think I am." Helen blinked, confusion clouding her thoughts. "What do you mean? Aren't you a farmer?" Mikkel let out a short, bitter laugh. "That's what I've been telling your uncle. But the truth is, I'm not just a farmer. I'm the CEO of one of the largest corporations in the city. My family, my wealth, is something I've kept hidden for years. And I never intended for you to be a part of that." Helen felt a wave of shock sweep through her. A CEO? She could hardly process the words. All this time, she had believed he was just a simple farmer, a man living in the countryside for reasons she couldn't understand. But now, everything she thought she knew about him had been shattered in one confession. "Why would you lie about that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you pretend to be someone else?" Mikkel lowered his gaze, his hands trembling slightly as he ran them through his hair. "Because I didn't want anyone to know who I really was. I came here to get away from the pressures of the city, from the expectations that come with my name and my wealth. I didn't want to be treated like a commodity, like something to be used for other people's gain. I didn't want to be seen as just a rich man. I wanted to know what it was like to live like a normal person, to see life through a different lens." Helen stood there, stunned. She hadn't expected this, she hadn't expected the man she was supposed to marry to be a billionaire, to be someone who lived a life of luxury and power. She had expected him to be just like the other men in the village, someone who worked hard to make a living, someone who shared the same struggles and dreams as her. But Mikkel, he was so much more than that. I didn't plan for any of this, Mikkel continued, his voice softer now. When I met you, Helen, I didn't know what to think. I wasn't expecting to feel anything. But I did. I didn't want to marry someone just because it was expected. I didn't want to be forced into a life I wasn't ready for. But the more time I spent with you, the more I realized that maybe I could make it work. Maybe I could have a life that wasn't defined by money or status. Helen's mind was reeling. She was struggling to understand the weight of what he had just told her. The CEO of a large corporation. How could she have known? She had been so focused on her own life, her own challenges, that she hadn't even considered the possibility of him being someone so different. Why didn't you tell me? She asked again, her voice trembling. Mikkel looked at her with a mixture of regret and sadness. I wanted to tell you the truth, but I didn't know how. I wanted to get to know you first, not for what I had, but for who I was. But it's clear now that I've made things more complicated than they needed to be. Helen took a step back, her head spinning. So, all this time, you've been pretending? You've been lying to me? I haven't lied about who I am in my heart, Mikkel said, his voice low. I'm still the same man. But yes, I've kept things from you. And I'm sorry for that. I should have told you sooner. Helen didn't know how to respond. She felt like the ground had been pulled out from under her. Everything she thought she knew about Mikkel, about their future together, had changed in an instant. But as she looked into his eyes filled with sincerity and regret, something inside her told her that he wasn't lying now. Maybe, just maybe, he was telling the truth. She didn't know what to feel. She didn't know if she could trust him completely. But one thing was certain, this marriage, this life that was being thrust upon her, had just become even more complicated. As Mikkel turned to leave, he paused at the door. I just wanted you to know. I never intended to hurt you. Helen nodded numbly, unsure of what to say. She was still processing everything he had just revealed, still trying to understand why he had kept his true identity a secret. But deep down, she knew one thing, her life was about to change forever. The next morning, Helen woke up with a heavy heart. She had barely slept the night before, her mind swirling with the things Mikkel had confessed. She couldn't shake the feeling that her entire life had been upended. She had always known that life in the village wasn't simple, but this was something she had never imagined. Her thoughts raced as she dressed for the day. Michael's confession had only complicated things. The man she had thought she knew had turned out to be someone entirely different. Could she trust him? Could she marry him knowing all that she now did about him? As the wedding day approached, so too did her decision. It was now or never. Would she accept this marriage, despite everything? Would she let go of the life she had known and step into something completely unknown? But deep inside, Helen knew she couldn't stay in the dark forever. She had to decide, whether to embrace this change, or to walk away from it all. As the door to her room creaked open, her aunt's voice broke through her thoughts. Helen, it's time to get ready. Mikkel is waiting. Helen looked at herself in the mirror one last time, her reflection a mixture of uncertainty and resolve. She had a choice to make. And the clock was ticking. Helen stood in front of the mirror, her fingers trembling as she adjusted the simple dress she had been asked to wear for the wedding. The fabric felt foreign against her skin, a constant reminder of the role she was about to play in a life that didn't feel like hers. She was torn between the life she had known and the uncertain future that loomed before her, shaped by a man who, until the previous evening, had been a stranger to her. Her aunt's voice called from downstairs again, sharper this time. Helen, we don't have all day. Mikkel is waiting. Helen closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on her chest. She had always been obedient, helping her aunt and uncle without question, doing whatever was expected of her. But now, it felt like she was standing on the edge of a precipice. One step forward, and everything would change. Her mind raced back to her conversation with Mikkel. A CEO? A billionaire? How could she have been so blind? He had hidden his true self so well, and yet there he was, a man she barely knew, offering her a life she hadn't asked for. But what choice did she have? Was she really going to turn her back on her family's expectations? They had already made the arrangements. The wedding was only days away. Her aunt and uncle would never understand if she backed out now. And what about Mikkel? He seemed sincere, but was it all too late? A knock at the door broke her thoughts. "Helen, are you all right?" Her aunt's voice was now softer, though still insistent. "You should hurry. Mikkel is waiting, and the guests are arriving soon." Helen's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't bear to face anyone, not yet. Not in this state of confusion. But she knew she couldn't hide forever. If she wanted to make a decision, if she wanted to change her life, she had to take that first step. With trembling hands, she opened the door. Her aunt smiled at her, though there was a hint of impatience in her eyes. "You look beautiful," her aunt said, her eyes briefly scanning Helen's face. "Come on, it's time. Mikkel is expecting you." Helen nodded silently, her mouth dry, and followed her aunt down the stairs. As they walked through the house, her heart seemed to beat louder, drowning out everything else. The air was thick with anticipation. She could hear the distant murmur of voices outside, guests who had arrived for the wedding, ready to witness the union of two people who didn't truly know each other. When they reached the front door, her uncle was standing there, a beaming smile on his face. "You're finally ready, Helen. It's time." She tried to smile back, but the expression felt strained, foreign on her face. The moment she stepped outside, the sunlight hit her face, but it did nothing to ease the heavy knot in her stomach. Her eyes searched the crowd of guests, but it wasn't them she was looking for. Her gaze was drawn to Mikkel, standing at the front with a small group of men. He was dressed in a sharp suit that contrasted against the simplicity of the rural surroundings. He was handsome, confident, yet there was a sadness in his eyes that made her heart twist. He looked up as she approached, his eyes locking with hers. His expression softened, and he took a step forward. For a brief moment, it felt as though the entire world stood still. The noise of the guests faded, leaving only the silence between them. Michael's eyes held something she couldn't quite place. Was it regret? Hope? Or perhaps both? Her aunt nudged her gently, urging her to walk the rest of the way to Mikkel. Helen's feet felt heavy, as though they were dragging her toward a future she wasn't sure she was ready for. As she reached Michael's side, the weight of his gaze was almost suffocating. She could feel his eyes on her, waiting for her to say something, do something. But words eluded her. The priest's voice broke the silence. "Are we ready to begin?" Helen's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The moment where her life would either continue on its familiar, uncertain path, or veer off in a direction she never expected. She opened her mouth to speak, to ask for a moment, but before she could form the words, a sudden, unexpected sound broke the tension. A car engine roared to life in the distance, a loud and insistent sound that caught everyone's attention. It grew louder, closer, until the vehicle came to a screeching halt in front of the house. Helen's heart skipped. She turned to Mikkel, but he had already stiffened, his expression unreadable. The sound of the car door slamming shut echoed through the air. "Helen, wait," a voice shouted from behind her. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The man who stepped out of the car was unfamiliar to her, yet there was something about him that made her blood run cold. He was tall, with a commanding presence, and his eyes were locked onto Mikkel. Michael's face drained of color, and he took a step back, as if he had seen a ghost. The stranger's gaze shifted to Helen, and a cold smile appeared on his lips. Helen, my name is Victor. I'm here to stop this wedding. Helen's heart hammered in her chest. What? What are you talking about? Victor didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes moved between Mikkel and her, as if sizing up the situation. Then, without a hint of hesitation, he spoke again. You're about to marry a man who isn't who he says he is. And you, Helen, deserve the truth. Helen's breath caught in her throat as the crowd murmured. Her eyes flickered to Mikkel, whose jaw was clenched tightly. She couldn't understand. What did this man mean? What truth was he referring to? Mikkel turned to her, his eyes full of desperation. Helen, don't listen to him. He's lying. I swear to you, But Victor wasn't finished. His next words hit Helen like a punch to the gut. Do you really think Mikkel is just some farmer? Or has he been hiding something far more dangerous from you? The world around Helen seemed to tilt. She looked at Mikkel, his face now a mixture of anger and fear, and for the first time, she wasn't sure who to trust.